Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Badass Confidence Coach podcast. My guest today is Dr. Amanda Kenderes. Did I say that right?
You did.
Yeah. And Amanda is this amazing author of a book that just came out that she wrote. It's called Talk Types. And for those of you who know me and those of you who have been listening to me, you know I love to talk. I like to listen, but I like to talk. So when she reached out to me to come on the podcast, I was all about it. So welcome, Amanda. Tell us about you. Tell us about why you wrote this book, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Anna, so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's dive in. Why did I write this book? It's the answers to questions I'd had for over 30 years. That's really it.
Since you were a kid.
I started out, and since I was a kid.
Yeah.
I mean, elementary school kid. It goes back. And I started out, of course, with these questions. They were personal questions. And then once I finally found the answers that were satisfying for me, I realized, gosh, I think these are answers a lot of other people would like to hear too.
Right.
So I decided to share. So that's sort of a quick answer to why I wrote the book. The story, you know, as a kid, I grew up internationally. My dad had a U.S. embassy job. So we moved every 3 years to a new continent. You know, I had to make new friends and adjust in every conceivable way to a new place, a new school, and so on. And I realized that if I was going to connect with anyone and have a good time in any one place, I'd have to do, connect quickly, right? Because I'd be moving on soon again. Right. So how do people connect through talk? So I thought about the kind of talk that I like to do is the deep talk.
You're not a
deep,
small
vulnerable.
talk. You're a small talk gal.
I am not. I'll do it. I've learned to do it, but it was never my thing. Yeah. So I would dive right in. I started out with the elementary school kids, the playground. How's your home life and what are your hopes? And
that was me. You're like a little therapist.
Well, this was the year. Yes, both of us.
Yes, that was me.
But okay. So, and there are absolutely others that were doing this, but we don't always find each other as kids. And so then for me, I thought, well, gee, maybe this isn't something kids do. So I tried it out with adults. What is happiness? I'd ask my teachers, how did you know you'd found the one if they were married? Wow. And that didn't go over very well either. And I get it. And in retrospect, I mean, there's a big age gap and and it's like, whoa, this is a little bit too much information for this child. I get it now, but in retrospect, or at the time, I was thinking, where does that leave me? Because if I can't connect with kids or my peers, and I can't connect with adults, and adults aren't doing this either, where does that leave me as an adult when I grow up? Kind of friends, where am I going to find belonging ultimately? Right. In different words. This is what I was thinking. I got quite depressed for a while, but instead of just letting it consume me, somehow I was able to just turn it into questioning. And I tried to understand wasn't working and what was. And when I did find connections, why did that happen versus when I didn't? And on and on and on. And so finally, when I was 19, I had an epiphany that, gosh, there are really only three kinds of talk, three communication categories. And from there until now, I'm 44 now, I fine-tuned the model and wrote the book. So it's been a lifetime.
Yeah.
It's here now.
Of exploration and discovery.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are the talk types? What are the three?
Yeah.
The three types.
So, what's interesting is if you study literature, conflict is categorizable into these finite categories. People have used gender-specific terminology because that's how it was done for eons. But, it's man versus man and man versus nature or man versus technology. There are only so many potential conflicts one can have. Same thing with communication. I discovered that actually, this big, massive, chaotic world of communication, actually, there are really only two fundamental reasons that we talk. And I'll sort of explain how I ended up at 3 from here and 6 talk types. But really, people only ever talk to share. We talk to share our experiences, or we talk to share our understanding. That's it. But because our understanding can be objective or subjective,
Mhm.
We end up with 3 communication categories ultimately. And when we rank these categories by preference, we get 6 talk types because there are only 6 variations of ranking these 3 categories from
Okay.
most preferred to least preferred.
What's the talk type of someone who talks a lot and doesn't listen and interrupts and
Rude. No. Here's the thing. I think people are really tempted, especially when folks first hear about this model, they're like, well, a couple things, first, here's my chance to validate myself and invalidate everybody else. But there's really no better or worse talk type. We're just different. So I wanted to kind of get that out there. And honestly, some people are okay with being interrupted and some people aren't. And maybe we can talk about that too. But the other thing I want to say is that the other inclination is to look at these different talk types and go, oh, well, which one is the social one? Which one is the introverted one? Or which one?
yes.
And honestly, we can be introverted or extroverted in each one. We all want to relate. We all want to connect. We all want to belong. We all may have a sense of humor, but we do it in different ways.
Yeah.
And so it's really not thinking about us in terms of this one is the social butterfly and that one's not. Yeah, we can all be even a highly factual person, which if you A dominant can be quite social.
So you're saying we can't put each other into boxes. You can be one way, but I'm an extrovert, but there's times I can be a little bit more of an introvert or maybe more of an ambivert where I'm not as talkative. I think I'm trying to
Well,
contextualize it.
let me back up and I'll say, and it's kind of funny, Anna, because I am absolutely kind of putting people in a box here because I'm typing people. But my caveat is don't put people in the wrong box and don't put people in a box that's not helpful or constructive. Boxes, in other words, definitions, labels, these kinds of things, they can be absolutely helpful or they can be harmful. We need them. The reason we need them, if I go in the grocery store, if I need to pick up some apples, I can quickly identify. There's so many apples at the different kinds at the grocery store, red, green, pink, different shapes. And I can still identify an apple. But if I had to define an apple, gosh, if we didn't have vocabulary, then we'd have to use so many more words. So a vocabulary word, a definition ultimately saves us the trouble of having to define everything we say, while we speak. So I think in that sense, boxes or definitions can be quite useful. We just have to be careful how we use them.
So let's take an example let's do 2 examples. Let's do a personal and professional life. So let's take somebody in the workplace. Why is it important for them to understand maybe their talk type and the talk types of their colleagues or coworkers? Why is that important for them in the workplace? Well, how will that help them? Maybe they're in middle management. Why is it good to know this?
So to answer this question, or really any, if I could just back up and give us just a quick lowdown of what the 3 categories are.
Oh, yes, sure.
And then get some context to answer this. I have a few kind of shorthand terms for the 3 categories in the book, A, B, and C, just because then we can really quickly talk about the talk types. You get the 6 talk types, A, B, A, C, B, A, B, C, C, A, and C, B. But A's are factual, they're informers, they are interested in sharing objective information and receiving objective information. That's what they're listening for. That's their goal. So they want to add knowledge to their plate. C's, if I could jump, because they're the other understanders, they're the meaning makers. They're interested in that deep. It's kind of like how you and I were as kids.
Right.
And probably now we still love that stuff.
Yes.
Because that's who we are.
Yes.
And so that deep meaning making, how have you grown and what makes you feel fulfilled and whatever, those kinds of things. That's C and meaning making. And that's subjective understanding because that's going to be different for each person. So it's subject dependent understanding. The B's are the relators. These are folks that their talk goal is not to be understood. Their talk goal is to be heard. They want to be heard. And so don't interrupt them. If you interrupt an A or a C, there's a fair chance that everything will be fine. Maybe even better, you'll improve the connection because the A and C is going, oh, you stopped me because you didn't understand. Well, of course, let's get you on the same page. Now your listener is aligned with you by interrupting and saying, hey, can you hold on a minute? I didn't quite get that. When folks say, well, don't interrupt, that's just bad communication practice. It is for a B. It's not necessarily for an A or a C.
Interesting.
Mhm.
I have not thought of it. I mean, I know from reading your book about this, but
Yep.
it was like, whoa, when I was reading your book, I'm like, oh, I always thought of it because we teach our kids don't interrupt. I mean, just recently, my sister was telling my nephew, who we were talking in the kitchen, he just started talking to us and she said, I'm talking, don't interrupt. I mean, that's how we've raised our kids across the board.
Absolutely. And to put this in perspective, of course, if somebody just interrupts maybe a conversation in the kitchen where two people are trying to understand each other and somebody
Right.
third party comes in and just starts
Right.
talking about and something unrelated,
Something,
well then yeah,
right.
that's a problem.
Right.
But if they interrupt to say, "Hey, wait, I didn't quite catch that." Now we're aligned.
Ah.
So of course the context of the interruption matters.
That's interesting to me. So I find that I'm in different categories at different times because I show up as a C, as a therapist, and as a life coach, and I show up as a B sometimes with my family members.
Well, you're probably a CB.
Yeah, I don't like because I'm from a loud Italian family. Everybody talks at the same time.
Yeah.
My family of origin,
Yeah.
even my family here with my adult kids, sometimes I'm like, don't interrupt me. I'm still talking. It's different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. If you have B in your talk type, you're probably going to identify with that feeling like you're going to get that sometimes. Don't interrupt. And it seems rude. And probably more often than not, if you're an AC or a CA, these folks don't have B. They're just not as likely going to resonate with that much. So, yeah, it's a fascinating kind of side, but important. It's a central tangent. It's a tangent, maybe, but it's central. I mean, interrupting is huge and in the dialogue about good communication and relationships.
I think it's fascinating to understand this about ourselves because so as a therapist, I'm always, I'm asking myself, and I know because I've done this work, where does that come from that the B type in me doesn't like to be interrupted? Absolutely, because I'm from one of 8 kids and I didn't feel heard when I was a
Yep.
child. And I know that it's not even it wasn't the subconscious in my early 20s, but when I did my own therapeutic work, I knew what that was about when I didn't like being interrupted because I had no voice. And now I don't feel that way as much as I used to, but I'm a B because of my family of origin issues. They're mostly resolved, but sometimes it does perk up. When I go back home, sometimes I'll feel that way. So that's
Oh
my
yeah.
talk type at home. It's interesting, right?
Yeah, and what I find is that we have a talk type that's consistent across the lifespan, but as you say, this is my talk type at home. Well, I'd like to kind of clarify that we all have one talk type that's our home base, that's most comfortable for us, but we can always dial up and dial down different
Yeah.
categories. A lot of people have to use A or factual objective information at work, for instance.
Yeah.
Okay, that regardless of whether you have A in your talk type or not. But it's really important to clarify here. Our talk type is based on our preferences, not our practices.
Okay.
So we might have to use it a ton, A or whatever category. But if it's not our favorite or our second favorite, it's not part of our talk type.
I see. Isn't that interesting? Okay. So let's go back now to the workplace.
Yep.
Let's go back
Yep.
to like you're a middle manager. Why is it important for us to understand our talk type and maybe to try to understand the talk types of those around us that we interface with quite a bit?
So just like a lot of businesses will bring in, the Myers-Briggs
Mhm.
personality model or Enneagram sometimes, etc., DISC, what have you. A lot of these models are useful because it gives us a vocabulary to identify other people. And then once we do that, we can kind of adjust our interactions with them in a way that reduces friction and conflict and improves communication and decision making and team building, I mean, all of it, really. So once we know people's talk types, we can adjust our communication with them and not take things personally. People who don't have A, for example, in their talk type, sometimes can feel offended if they're talking to an A, especially an A dominant. Sometimes they can come across as abrasive to CBs and BCs. And the CB or the BC is talking, and then the A dominant says, "Are you sure about that? Let me look it up and do a fact check." Well, wait a minute, are you saying I'm not trustworthy or valid or what? And it can be, and that kind of fact checking can feel personal. And that BC or CB might feel like, well, everybody would feel that way if you were fact checked. The funny thing is, it's not true. ACs and CAs and ABs and anybody, basically everybody who has A, which is the other four talk types, probably would not feel quite so, take that personally or feel
Yeah.
upset at all.
That is interesting. And I'm thinking about conversations right now as you're speaking in a different way because, I use cognitive behavioral therapy with my therapy and my coaching clients. So, cognitive behavioral therapy, we start with what are unhelpful thought patterns and thought distortions. And I'm bringing your book into the way I'm working with my clients. And I'm thinking, I'm having this light bulb moment, this aha moment of that in a way, we might be weaponizing other people's ways of talking against them when it's different from the
Mhm.
way we communicate and how we like to show up and how we like to be maybe in dialogue and communication with people. That may not be their way. So we can get to a place, we can have thoughts and ideas about somebody and the way they are, they're annoying to me because I'm not that way. We can kind of weaponize it, I'm
Absolutely.
thinking.
And that's beautifully said. And I think with CBT, yeah, they get to that sort of adjusted thought, corrected thought, I guess,
Right.
whatever the terms,
The reframes. Yeah.
those, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a much less polarizing and pathologizing path.
Yes.
Yeah,
It
it's a
really
nicer
is.
path. It,
It is. It throws grace to people. It's just like, oh, because I'm thinking
yes,
about people as you're speaking. I'm like, oh, I know people like this who are A's. I'm like, oh, that's just how they are.
that's how they are.
Yeah, that's how they love knowledge and they want to impart knowledge. And sometimes I feel like they can be a little rough around the edges. Once you get to know them, they can be really wonderful. But when they first show up, you're like, it's like just like not tasteful to me.
Yes.
And that's so interesting to hear you talk about these different talk types because I don't know, my mind is really going with maybe I'm thinking a little differently. It's a
Oh,
paradigm shift, really.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think so. Whichever our field or our application, there are so many of these kind of paradigm shifts that happen for people with their own specific industry, if you will. And it's mind blowing. And what's also mind blowing is to think, okay, like you were saying, Anna, you're looking at folks that and you've experienced, and your clients they've experienced, seeing them in a certain way, they might come across as abrasive initially, etc. But what's mind blowing is that for those people, those quote unquote abrasive folks, we come across the same way to them, no doubt.
I
In
was
this,
just thinking that too. Look, how do we look to them?
yes, yes.
Probably a little exasperating, to be honest with you.
In other words, yeah, and it won't be the same. We won't be using the same adjectives to describe each other, but that initial feeling of exasperation will be the same in many cases because
Yeah.
we're just missing each other. But when we can contextualize why and understand why, it lets people off the hook, and it's much more of a generous way to live and go through
Absolutely.
life.
When I ask you, I'm looking at some of my questions that I have for you. So, what are three? I love this because you threw this out to me and I love this. What are three fundamental reasons why people like to talk?
Oh,
What
well,
have you come up with?
those
Those
are
are
the
the talk
three.
types?
Yeah,
Okay.
those are the three communication categories. So yeah,
Okay.
the factual, the relating, and the meaning making. Yes,
Okay.
that's the foundation for everything.
Okay. Okay. It's important to me that the supplements I take are of the highest quality. And that's why for 5 years, I've been drinking AG1. Unlike many supplement brands, AG1 conducts relentless testing to set the standard for purity and potency. I know I can trust what's in every scoop of AG1 because it's tested for 950 contaminants and banned substances, while the industry standard typically only tests for 10. Taking care of my health shouldn't be complicated, and AG1 simplifies this by covering my nutritional basis and setting myself up for success in just 60 seconds. AG1's ingredients are heavily researched for efficacy and quality, and I love that every scoop also includes prebiotics, probiotics, and digestive enzymes for gut support. So if you want to replace your multivitamin and more, start with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 plus K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription at drinkag1.com/Anna. That's drinkag1.com/Anna. Check it out. You will not regret it. What can change? What is unlikely to change in a person over time? I mean, can people change and move out of these talk types and go
Yeah.
into another, or is this hardwired in us?
Yeah, so that's a big question that I get a lot. And honestly, everything points to this being hardwired in us. We can see talk types from a very early age in toddlers, and they don't change. Sometimes it can look like we're changing because, for example, let's say, I've got friends in lots of different situations just like this, where maybe, let's say, a CB who was raised in a family that had no C. So all the siblings, parents, nobody had C. They were the only C in the family. And so they wouldn't feel safe probably to kind of
Right.
let out that deep stuff and be vulnerable, which wouldn't feel safe. And so on the flip side, if they were in a dominant kind of family, they would have to build their A muscle in a way just to survive in their own family and to relate and to
Right.
feel like they belong. So here we go. Then here's somebody who maybe at 18, they go to college, they leave their house. It's a CB. They've always been a CB, but until they kind of settle into themselves and find their own rhythm, they might come across as more of a AC or AB until they realize, they meet some other C's and they don't have the vocabulary for it, but meeting people going, wow, yeah, I feel so at home now. And letting down that, a weight they've been holding, like, I don't need to keep this has been taxing, for me personally. And then letting that down and going and finding themselves. So someone like that could look like they're a different talk type or that they've changed over time, but really they've settled into themselves after they've left that kind of immediate family and context. And then not to say, we can build muscle in the categories we don't have. Absolutely. Just like that person in that example had to do growing up. But it doesn't
I-
change. What is our, our
But you
kind
can
of,
build a muscle. So it's hardwired and you can build the muscle to move into an A or a B or a B or a C.
yeah. And, some of the most psychologically developed people on the planet. And I say that because nowadays with the internet, we have access to people from everywhere and
Right.
the best of the best and the lowest of the low,
Yeah.
of all of
Yes.
humanity, really.
Yes.
And folks that really are very psychologically developed and have spent a lot of time on personal development and growth and
Mhm.
spiritual growth and all, they often, their talk type is often elusive initially. You can't quite tell because they've developed that muscle across the board so well and being able to interact with people and adjust to their audience that it can be hard to see, but
You're
it's still
absolutely
there.
right. Yeah. I'm thinking about the person, I'm going back down memory lane for myself and thinking about all the conversations I've had really as a therapist when with individual couples and families. And then I'll pull a family in when I'm seeing an individual and we'll do maybe 1 or 2 sessions with the parents or the siblings, the kids who have felt like the air quote black sheep or the different one in the family. And they don't feel seen and heard. And it's so interesting because thinking about it in the context of talk types, I'm realizing that maybe they were the one who was more of the C or maybe a B, and other members of the family are more A's. I would say quieter, more introverted parents, and they had maybe 3 kids, and this one kid is the one who's much more emotive and developed and didn't feel seen and didn't feel heard and developed mental health issues because of it. And getting together and seeing these family members and understanding, like, I see what it's completely validating 90% of the time for me to meet family members and like, this is what they're talking about. This is,
Wow.
yeah. And they are just
Wow.
different. They're just different.
That's brilliant. No, that's a brilliant perspective. Yeah, no. And I hadn't quite thought of it that way either. And it's interesting because, prior to the publication of my book, I've been kind of in hermit mode, just
Yeah.
I'm gonna get this concise and get it out there. And now I'm having conversations with people and hearing some of these applications for the first time with people from just diverse fields. And it's just a beautiful thing to see. Because absolutely, I mean that 100%.
Yeah.
That makes sense. 100%.
And rather than pathologizing maybe the other members of the family, it's really that, your mom and dad, they're just they're wired different. They're not like you. But that you're not, let's not weaponize or pathologize you because you're acting out via maybe some anxiety or maybe some eating disorder behavior, whatever it might be. Maybe just being a rebel and going out late at night partying and doing all the things that sometimes teenagers can do. But that you're trying to find a way, and it's a period of adolescence of figuring out who I am outside of my mom and dad, and that they relate differently. And that's
Absolutely. And I think what's so powerful is that oftentimes in these contexts, especially young people, but adults too, let's be honest, people act out oftentimes when they don't have language to express and communicate what's going on underneath.
All ages. All ages.
In that sense, the vocabulary that we can get from this talk type model, which talk is fundamental to every single thing we do. It's how we interface with the world, with people, with ourselves, through thought. I mean, it's everything. If we can have a fundamental vocabulary about talk, we can start to heal some of these issues. For sure.
How does knowing your talk type, how could it increase a person's confidence?
Because first of all, it's incredibly validating. As a kid, I spent years thinking, gosh, I was defective somehow. Something's wrong with me because I wasn't like many other people. I could find people here and there that I could connect. But by and large, I was still quite different. From a talk type perspective, that makes sense because as one of 6 talk types, well, we're always going to feel different when we're around the other 5 types.
Right.
So once I realized I had this epiphany about the talk type model, then I realized that, okay, nothing's wrong with me. I'm not an abnormal communicator person. I'm a normal CA. That's my talk type. I'm a normal CA. I'm not an abnormal BC. I'm not an abnormal AB. There isn't one normal way to talk. There are 6 normal ways to talk.
Right.
And I'm one of them. That's the first thing, is it's just incredibly validating. That's the first step, I think, to building confidence, is just that sense of I'm okay.
So you all need to get the book, those who are listening and watching on YouTube, because you'll understand in much more detail what we're talking about. So let's go back. You're a CA. So C is the meaning making person, the person who in conversation wants to understand the meaning maker. The A is the person who's really the seeker of knowledge, wants knowledge, right? Understand knowledge, impart, to develop knowledge and impart knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So that's a CA for you. The C is prominent, would you say? C, then A?
Yes. Correct. So C would be the prominent one, and then A would be secondary. And the A sits at the service of the C. So, when I'm collecting A information, I'm thinking about where it can fit in. Like there's always a C program running in the back of my mind.
In the back. Okay. So this is important for you all to understand, because once you go through this book, you'll understand, oh, this is my talk type and this is how I show up in the world. It really can help you understand. And what about with our family members? Let's talk about that a little bit, because like I just talked about, having a family therapy session, thinking about that differently. What would you say to the person who maybe they're an A, maybe, and there's outgoing, talkative people around them. What would you say to that person, other than you need to read the book and you need to understand this a little bit better? But what would you say to a family member who's listening right now, is like, I don't know where I fit in with my family. I don't know how we all communicate to each other. It's just not always great. If anything, we don't talk about what's really going on.
I mean, really, if we were to put the spotlight on any individual talk type and then assume that their family is maybe not aligned with that, we could really have a whole conversation about any one of them. For an A or an AB specifically, an A dominant is going to be interested in, like we said, facts and information. They're going to want to be understood, and they're going to connect and relate to people and feel known. If you understand how they think and what they think, they're going to feel understood. And if they're trying to, maybe they'll tell a story, or they're telling their story in A. Maybe somebody listening says, okay, I get it. Right. You don't need to give me all these details or something backs up.
Right.
What's the point? Well, for the A wouldn't be giving those details unless there was a factual reason. They're building to something, and that they want you to understand. And those details are kind of constructing that context or that story, that understanding. And so it could feel exasperating for that A dominant. Like you don't want to understand. And that means you don't want to connect. I mean, each person, doesn't matter the talk type, wants to feel connected to others, wants to feel
Right.
understood, wants to feel known, wants to feel a sense of belonging. Those are all human needs, but how we do it is different. I think within the context of families, once we know the talk types, we can put into perspective all the relations. Everything just kind of makes sense. So our kids, if we have kids, we can look at our own talk type. If we're partnered, we can identify our partner's talk type and then our kids and go, okay, now what are the dynamics? Because what the talk type model does, it predicts connection and conflict. So once we know the talk types, we can say, okay, here are the areas we're probably going to connect, and here are the areas we're probably going to experience conflict. And once we know those, we can be much less defensive and be much more offensive. And we can take things less personally, be gracious, kind of like we talked about. And we can do this thing for our own parents as adult children and look back at our own childhoods in a much friendlier, kind way.
You know what is trending now on social media? Well, it's trending on TikTok and it's very big. Not just trending on social media, but it's a thing in the millennials and the Gen Z generation is this issue of going low contact or no contact with their parents. So they're cutting off, we call them cutoffs in family therapy. They're cutting off relationships with their adult parents because, and I'm pulling that into, I'm listening to you and I'm pulling that, your theory about talk types into what is going on in our country right now with adult children. Many have been in therapy, not everybody, but they have decided through effort, some effort, maybe, I don't know, right? This is thousands and thousands. The algorithm keeps sending it to me. So I'm seeing all these TikToks about adult children with their spouses and their own small children saying, yeah, we're not doing the holidays with you anymore. Complete cutoffs, or I would even say at the minimum, try to go low contact because it's very, very painful for these grandparents and these, Gen X
Wow.
and baby boomers to have lost these relationships with their adult children. And I did a post on it on TikTok and wow, did it go viral? And I got opinions both ways at me. And, you gotta have, yeah, put on your big girl pants and you go on some of these social media because you're going to get
That's
it.
right.
And I knew it. Yeah, it's okay. I'm a big girl. I can handle it. But it was really not towards me. People didn't like what I said. Some people liked what I said, but it was really a projection of what was going on inside of them. So I don't
Yeah.
take it personally, but it really, many of the later Gen X and the baby boomers are upset because like I've raised these kids. I've done this more than half my life. I've raised these kids. Well, something about those millennials and the Gen Zers didn't feel heard and seen and listened to. And it must have continued for many of them. And I know because I see this in my practice, and they are going low contact. I don't really almost ever recommend no contact. It's got to be a very toxic situation for me to even really support that because I think that there will be regrets down the road. I think that those relationships are so, so important. But there are situations where I understand why people do that. And I'm thinking about people's different talk types and how parents talk to their children, how they raise them, and how these kids grew up to be teenagers and young adults and adults. And now they have maybe their way of talking. That's what I'm wondering. Did it
Yeah.
change their way of talking now with their life partner? And they've decided that I don't want this anymore. There's a way that we're talking to each other that's shutting people down. Does that
Yes.
make
Oh,
sense?
absolutely. Oh, of course. I think part of the reason for that is that there aren't really great words for this, but essentially taking personally the qualities that people have that they can't change. Yes. Can their parents, so maybe these are those kids like we're talking about that maybe some of them have landed into your office where they acted out at, maybe as kids and as teenagers. And now as young adults, they say, well, you know what? I don't have to interact with that anymore. I'm going to cut them off.
Right. Right.
That's a
It's a
choice. That's
choice.
one
It's a
option.
choice. Yep. Yep. Yep.
Obviously, the children did not get their needs met. There was something about the needs didn't get met. Okay, fine. Now, once the parents learn what those needs are, I think those parents, unless there's something else going on where, then sometimes that happens where people just have limitations. But provided that it's that they have the ability to grow a little bit, yeah, they
Mhm.
can probably adjust. a little bit to their kids and make some changes, and the kids can meet the parent. We can get a little closer. We can bridge
Right.
that gap. We can get closer. Or is it ever going to be 100%? No, I mean, that's just sort of the nature of life. I mean, we're all
Right.
hardwired differently. We're not going to change each other's hardwiring, but we
Right.
can change our own soft wiring. You know, if the parents refuse to try and get closer to bridging that gap, well, then that would be a harder ask. But if they're trying, I think, yeah, then certainly we would hope there would be more grace there. But what I'll add is that it's the same thing that's happening on a national and global scale and global level with political discussions. And
Yes.
um, it's
Yes.
just, you know,
It's
we're brushing each
exhausting,
other off.
Amanda.
And
It's
it is,
exhausting.
it is, you know, it's funny because you've got folks who are brushing each other off because they're not being heard. Some of the folks are like, we need to be heard. Others are saying we need to be understood politically. You need to hold space for us. There's no meaningful impact or visibility that we get as a group. You know, A, B, and C. It's all interacting.
There's no
No.
patience for one another. There's no patience to quiet oneself down and to open up your, like I always say, there's a reason why God gave you 2 ears and one mouth. I mean,
Yeah.
2 ears, one mouth. Nobody, and I shouldn't say nobody, I am making a blanket statement there. Many people don't want to quiet themselves down and open up their ears to listen to the other person's talk type because they're all about the not, like maybe they're more of an emotional speaker. They're more knowledge. Okay, I don't want to listen to that. This is what we see. We've all seen it. So you have different talk types coming together, but we're not throwing each other grace and having patience to listen to another viewpoint.
And ultimately, the talk types, they're one level above a much more, even more fundamental desire or need and value system. We all have different needs. So that the C dominants are
Mhm.
going to have a need for meaning and value and purpose and direction and et cetera, connection with people and making an impact and this sort of thing. And it's going to manifest in many ways in our talk. But underneath our talk is this deep need. Same for B's and A's. We all have different needs. If we can look at the talk and we can use the talk as a proxy, then we can start to unpack what's really happening underneath and try and get our needs met. Because right now, everybody's shouting. Okay, it's more hyperbole, but so many
Yes. Yes.
people are just shouting, and very few are listening. And it's a challenging time.
Yeah, it is. That could be a whole other conversation
They really could.
unto itself, right?
But
Yeah.
it all, yeah, it all relates. And you know what's happening on the individual and familial kind of unit is just amplified globally. I mean, it's really just,
Yeah.
yeah, look at
Exactly.
it.
I think that way. I think like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk quickly about America, United States, the talk types of Americans, because, you've been all over the world. And is it fair to say, I mean, I think Americans, we're an outgoing bunch. And I've seen it in my practice when I talk with my clients who are more the introverts. It can be hard in this country. It can be hard for them because this is such a extroverted, talkative nation. And okay. So everybody listening, please know that I am really painting with a broad brushstroke. But I do think Canadians my whole family is Canadian. So we're the only ones who live in the United States. Everybody on both my mom and dad's sides, Canada. Canadians are the most friendly people. They're lovely, lovely. And they're also a really outgoing. So I would say North America, they're an outgoing people. But other parts of the world are not that way. So I think it's interesting when you talked about how you grew up, you traveled all over because your father worked for the embassy or was an ambassador.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does it show up in life here, intersecting with people from all different backgrounds in the United States? We are the melting pot. Do you see it show up in some ways in your work and in writing your book?
It's interesting to have a conversation about the US and other countries and how the talk types kind of overlay on that. I would say that there are two main things going on: time and culture. So in my experience around the world, I guess some 40 countries now, there are different pockets of the world that tend to lean more towards certain talk types as a culture than others. So in the Middle East, it's much more C dominant, so CA, CB. And in a lot of Asia, we have more AB and BA. The C is not as strong. And which would make it a lot harder for individuals who have that category as a dominant to fit in with their larger context. Now, that said, so while we have that, I'll add that time is another dimension. If we look at the United States, right now, I would say we're very much in a BA culture. Everybody wants to be heard. Everybody's shouting, as it were, and trying to drown out the other. And the meaning, the vulnerability. There's not a lot of space for vulnerability right now. We're much more in a BA culture. But if we go back to, say, the 50s, just as an example, I would say there we could probably type the US culture as much more AC. You look at talk shows and game shows, there's a lot of A dominant, the fireside chat with the president. It's with some C, and even looking at Disney films and how they've changed over time from Bambi, which is basically just some A facts about animals that live in the forest, and then Bambi's mom dies, and that's a C moment. And we actually had space to process that grief in the Bambi movie. But today, Disney films are much more BA. We'll get a C moment, a rare C moment in the film, and then somebody will they'll bomb it and hurry, let's just make some crazy explosion happen, or somebody interject quickly because we can't handle that much C, and they'll make it stop, make that C stop. So it's a fascinating study to kind of look at cultures across time, because we do shift as a culture. In fact, the Germans have a word for that, zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the age or the era. And so the talk type can capture the spirit of an era if we look at a culture across time, and looking at the artifacts of a culture, the media, art, writing, etc. Literature can give us kind of a window into that.
So interesting, taking the macro level view of time, history, how we as Americans, North Americans think, how we communicated, how we speak, looking at other cultures, and then where we are today in 2025. It's really very interesting. And so I could talk to you for, of course, another hour about all of this and go into more detail, but we're out of time. So Dr. Amanda, tell us where we can find you. Tell us where we can find your book. The book is right here, everybody. If you're watching on YouTube, it's called Talk Types. It's an excellent book. Well done. Brava. Thank you for this gift to all of us. So let us know all the good stuff about you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So book, and you can find it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, also on Audible. That version just came out. You can go to amandakenderes.com to be in touch with me, and also talktypes.com, where we have beta version of the talk type test is coming out. So we'll see how it goes, make some adjustments. But for now, I'm going to give it a go. That's going to be available shortly. And maybe by the time you're watching this, it may be up. Those would be the ways. And then social media, all the social media is under Amanda Kenderes, so you can find me.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much for this conversation. And until next time.
Thank you.